My name is Noah Carter. I'm 37 years old and a retired tactical intelligence officer. I've spent most of my adult life in places where the silence between decisions could fill a room with tension thicker than any smoke from a battlefield. But somehow, nothing felt heavier than the air inside my father's funeral hall. The scent of cut flowers mingled with too much cologne and too many unsaid things. Faces I hadn't seen in years were there, nodding politely, whispering their rehearsed condolences, eyes sliding away too quickly. In that room, grief wasn't the loudest thing. It was an expectation. It was judgment. I stood near the back, not because I wanted to be out of sight, but because it gave me the best vantage point. Old habit. I scanned the crowd like I used to scan a briefing file. My brother Brandon stood front and center, accepting every handshake like a politician at a fundraiser. My mother sat stiff beside him, her hands folded tight in her lap, her eyes never once meeting mine. I hadn't said a word since I walked in, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I didn't feel the need to perform. My grief was real, but not for a man who had never really seen me. It was for the version of me that used to hope he would. There's a strange stillness that comes before an operation begins. You feel it deep in your chest, like the pause before a storm cracks open the sky. I felt that same stillness now. Except this time, the battlefield wasn't some foreign desert or concrete bunker. It was here, in this polished hall, surrounded by people who thought they knew me. People who were about to find out how wrong they were. Growing up, there were always two versions of our family story. There was Brandon's version, loud and full of trophies, touchdowns, and framed certificates on the hallway wall. And then there was mine, quieter, harder to see. The kind that didn't make for good dinner conversation. Brandon was the golden son. He had that smile people trust without question. He walked into a room and immediately took up space, and people applauded him for it. He played varsity everything, dated homecoming queens, and followed my dad into the family business like it was preordained. Me? I read too much, asked too many questions, liked to be alone. I never minded being different until I realized different meant invisible, at least in our house. My father used to joke that I was born taking notes. I thought it was a compliment until I got older and understood he meant I was always observing, never doing. Every time Brandon succeeded, the house lit up like Christmas. My mom would bake, my dad would pour drinks, and the neighbors would come over. When I graduated top of my ROTC class, I got a nod and a maybe we'll do dinner this weekend. That weekend never came. I told them once I was accepted into a military intelligence program, most people didn't even know it existed. My mother smiled and said that sounded interesting. My father didn't ask a single follow-up question. But when Brandon closed a real estate deal on a lake house, there were balloons in the kitchen and a group toast in the living room. At some point, I stopped sharing things. Not because I didn't want to, but because it hurt too much to pretend it mattered. The distance between what I knew I was capable of and what they believed about me was wider than any battlefield I'd ever crossed. Brandon never had to ask for respect. It was handed to him like an inheritance. I had to earn mine in silence, in the dark, where no one clapped and no one saw. And even then, it felt like I had to apologize for how I chose to serve. They called me quiet, reserved. Some even said I lacked personality. What they never saw was the fire I kept under control. The strength it took to stay steady when everything around me wanted to shake me loose. There was this one time I was maybe 12, Brandon broke a neighbor's window playing baseball. My father paid for it, clapped him on the back, and said boys will be boys. A week later, I accidentally knocked over a glass figurine in the living room and was grounded for 2 weeks. I learned early that justice had a favorite child. None of this was loud. My resentment never came out as yelling or slamming doors. It settled deeper, built up in layers, like stone. It made me precise, patient, focused. And I guess, in a twisted way, I should thank them. Because the man I became didn't come from applause. He came from silence. They never saw me, not really, but they would, eventually, not through a speech, not through a confrontation, but through the one thing they always claimed to respect: power. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner. My father had just gotten back from a conference and invited a few close friends over. Brandon had arrived late but still managed to be the first thing anyone noticed. He dropped his keys on the granite counter, tossed his blazer onto the back of a chair, and launched into a story about a six-figure commission he'd just closed. Everyone laughed at the right beats, nodded at the numbers, and toasted him like he'd just won a medal. My father beamed the whole time. When dinner was served, my mother made his favorite dish: steak, medium rare, roasted garlic potatoes. A bottle of red no one touched until he lifted his glass. That's when it happened. My father stood, cleared his throat, and raised his glass again. To Brandon, a born closer, a man who understands how to win in the real world. The table applauded like it was gospel. He looked right at me when he said it. Or through me. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. When the room quieted, I cleared my throat, hesitating just enough for my mother to glance over. I said I'd recently been promoted and had led an op that resulted in intercepting a major cyber threat. I didn't share the full details. I wasn't allowed to, but it was a big deal. My father blinked, then nodded slowly. That's great. Keep it up. His voice dropped back into the conversation before I'd finished my sentence. Brandon smirked into his wine glass. I sat there with my fork in midair, trying to chew through something that suddenly felt impossible to swallow. The rest of the evening blurred. The voices, the laughter, the stories that circled around Brandon like satellites. I smiled. I nodded. I even laughed at the appropriate times. But inside, something snapped shut. That night, I realized I wasn't just underappreciated. I was unacknowledged, invisible, even when present. That dinner didn't just sting, it rewrote something inside me. I stopped looking for his approval, and I started building the kind of life he'd never understand. There's a room buried deep in a federal facility, with no windows and lights that never flicker. It hums with the low vibration of secured air and quiet urgency. This is where I work, or where I used to, before retirement. On that particular day, I stood at the head of a long black table, watching a satellite feed flicker to life on the main screen. Across from me sat 6 men, hardened faces, decorated careers, operators who had seen more than most and lived to tell it. They didn't speak unless necessary, and when they listened, it was with full attention. I wasn't their commander, but they followed my intel like it was law. Elise stood at my side, calm, steady. She had briefed me for years. Her title didn't matter in that room. Her mind did, just like mine. Together, we outlined a layered plan to dismantle a rogue cyber cell in Eastern Europe. It wasn't theoretical, it was live. The projection on the screen wasn't just data, it was real-time movement. Streets, cars, shadows that shifted slightly every few seconds. I clicked through the layouts with precision, voice even, tone clear. I explained the entry points, escape vectors, and psychological profiles of the targets. I told them what to say to get in, what not to say to get out. The men nodded, took notes. They didn't smile or make small talk. That wasn't why we were there. When I finished, their team leader looked at me and said, "Copy that. We move on your signal." He didn't need reassurance. He had it the moment I opened my mouth. This was the world my family would never understand. Here, there were no toasts or public praise, no congratulatory dinners, but there was something better: quiet, unwavering trust. Respect that didn't need a ceremony, and that trust wasn't given because of a name. It was earned, over the years, through clarity, accuracy, and calm under pressure. I'd built this life from the ground up, while my family thought I sat behind a desk somewhere, pushing paper. They never saw the classified files, the black sites, the red line briefings that determined what stayed standing and what didn't. They never saw the pressure, the calculations, the responsibility that came with being the last voice before a mission launched. And that's fine. They didn't need to know, because I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it because I was good at it. Because people I trusted put their lives in my hands and never had to question whether I could carry the weight. Elise glanced at me during the debrief and gave the smallest nod. That's all we ever needed. In this world, we didn't have to prove anything to anyone. We knew who we were. We knew what we were worth. The contrast was almost laughable. In one world, I was a background figure, overshadowed and overlooked. In the other, I was the anchor, the strategist, the one who made sure everyone made it home. That's why I didn't flinch when the funeral came, why I didn't crumble under the weight of family theatrics. I had already walked through fire, and when the time came, I knew exactly which side of myself I would bring into that room. Not the son they thought they knew, but the man they never bothered to see. The chapel smelled like lilies and overpolished wood. Brandon stood near the casket, shaking hands, nodding, holding eye contact just long enough to look sincere. His voice carried softly through the room, just enough emotion to pass for grief but not enough to feel real. He was performing, like always. I watched from the side aisle, still and unreadable. My suit was pressed, my shoes shone, my posture relaxed. But inside, my mind was already calculating. A faint buzz in my pocket pulled my attention. I slipped one hand into my jacket and glanced down. One line from Elise. "Brandon's filming you. Stay steady." I didn't need the reminder. I already knew. I'd seen the subtle shift in his behavior the moment I arrived. He greeted me with too much warmth, too much familiarity for someone who hadn't texted me in 3 years. There was a second phone in his jacket pocket. He'd kept tapping it like he was checking time, but the camera was angled just right to catch me if I cracked. He wanted a reaction, maybe a slip of emotion, maybe a stray comment that could be twisted later. He wanted to reduce me to the caricature he always painted when I wasn't in the room. Angry, unstable, the odd brother who never quite fit. What he didn't know was that I had seen this coming. Days before the funeral, I had reviewed the guest list, memorized the layout of the hall, and placed quiet safeguards. I hadn't come to grieve. I'd come to execute a plan. The moment I saw his setup, something shifted. I stopped being the son. I became the operator. My pulse slowed, my breath steadied. Emotion had no place here anymore. This was a theater, and Brandon was playing checkers. I was running chess 4 moves ahead. I looked across the room and caught Elisa's eye. She gave the smallest nod. No words, no need. I'd already made my decision. Brandon thought this was his moment. But he was standing on a stage I built, and he didn't even know the curtains were about to drop. My thumb hovered over the screen, the letters already typed. One word, vigil. It looked harmless sitting there in gray font, but it was anything but harmless. It was a switch, a signal, a reckoning. I hit send. For a second, nothing happened. The pastor kept speaking in that same low, rehearsed tone. Brandon's smirk stretched wider, like he thought the silence meant he'd won. And then it happened. Directly across the aisle, a man stood. No expression, no sound, just a quiet rise to full height, hands folded behind his back. Then another man was by the floral arrangements. Then 2 near the exit. In less than 5 seconds, 10 men stood scattered through the crowd. Different ages, different builds, but every one of them had the same posture, the same stillness, like statues waiting for orders. The room shifted. You could feel it in the air, like a wire pulled too tight. Conversations died mid-sentence. The pastor lost his place. Even the music humming from the speakers faded into irrelevance. Heads turned, whispers froze in throats. People looked from face to face, then all eyes settled on me. I didn't move. I didn't need to. Their presence said everything. Brandon turned pale. His eyes darted around the room, trying to process what was happening, who these men were, and why they were staring straight ahead like a coordinated wall of silence. My mother gripped the edge of the pew, her knuckles white. For the first time in a long time, she looked at me, really looked, and I saw it hit her. The recognition, the recalibration. Her son, the quiet one, had just filled the room without raising his voice. Elise stepped forward from the far side of the hall and took her place beside me. She didn't touch me, didn't need to. Her presence confirmed everything. This wasn't chaos, this was choreography. Brandon's hand twitched toward his phone, but it slipped. It clattered on the marble floor. The sound echoed louder than any eulogy ever could. And in that silence, I became the center, not of drama, of command. The room belonged to me now, and everyone knew it. The silence after the men stood wasn't empty. It was thick, alive. It pressed in from all sides like the air before a thunderclap. Brandon didn't move. His mouth hung slightly open, still trying to make sense of what just happened. The smugness had drained from his face. What replaced it was something I had never seen from him before: fear. My mother sat frozen, her back rigid against the pew. Her eyes locked on me like she was trying to decode a language she never cared to learn. I didn't look at either of them. I didn't have to. Every eye in the room had already shifted. I was no longer the brother in the shadow. I was the only one casting it. I took a small step forward, nothing dramatic. Just enough to signal it was my turn. Then I spoke. Just one sentence. We're here to honor a man who believed in strength. Today I show mine. That was it. No emotion, no bitterness. No, look toward Brandon. The weight wasn't in the words. It was in the delivery, in the silence that followed. Elise moved beside me and stood still, her presence steady as stone. Her eyes didn't scan the room. She didn't flinch. She knew the choreography because she helped write it. Without a touch, without a word, we were a unit. Every detail was planned. Every movement meant something. Brandon shifted slightly, like he wanted to interrupt, to claw the moment back into his control. But he didn't. He knew. There was no recovery from this. Not in that room. Not with the way everyone now looked at him, and then at me. No one clapped. No one cheered. That would have broken the spell, but the energy had changed. It belonged to me now. The man they'd once called distant. Awkward. The man who never fit the family mold had just redrawn the room in his image. I didn't need applause. I didn't need their words. Because silence, when you've earned it, speaks louder than anything else. And in that moment, it said everything I ever needed them to hear. 6 months later, the world had quieted. Not in the way that feels empty, but in the way that feels earned. My life moved forward with a kind of stillness I hadn't known before. The right kind. I was walking out of a closed-door meeting at Langley when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out without urgency. The message preview was short, from my mother. Brandon wants to talk. He's sorry. Can we meet? I stared at the screen for a long moment. Not in anger, not even in hesitation, just observation. Like I was looking at a message meant for someone I used to be. Someone is still hoping to be heard. Still trying to matter to people who never made space for him. But I wasn't that person anymore. I had built a different life. One that didn't require their apology to feel whole. One where silence meant peace, not punishment. I pressed and held the message. My thumb hovered for a second before tapping archive. Just like that, it was gone. Not deleted, just moved. Out of sight, out of weight. Elise stood waiting a few feet ahead, hands tucked into her coat. She looked over and caught my eye. I didn't say a word, just gave a small nod. She nodded back. New questions, new need. We walked down the corridor together, no rush, no tension, just two people who had weathered storms and come out the other side quieter, stronger, and finally free. There was nothing left to fix, no more battles to win. The war had ended, and this walk, side by side, was our peace. Family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's the people who stand with you when no one else will. The ones who don't need to be asked, who show up when it matters, and stay when things get quiet. I used to think I had to earn my place at someone else's table. But I learned real loyalty doesn't need permission. It shows itself in silence, in presence, in trust that doesn't waver. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever had to find your worth outside their approval, share your story. You're not alone. You're seen here.